George Harrison was often the most serious-minded Beatle when it came to music, spirituality, and artistic expression. But that doesn't mean he treated every Beatles song as sacred. Inside the studio, George could be just as dismissive as John Lennon or Paul McCartney when a song felt deliberately silly, unfinished, or simply not worth taking seriously. The White Album in particular gave the Beatles enormous freedom to experiment, joke around, and record ideas that would never have survived under normal circumstances. Some became classics. Others were little more than musical sketches. These are 5 Beatles songs that reveal a different side of George Harrison, the Beatle who sometimes knew exactly when not to take a song seriously. Number 5. Wild Honey Pie, 1968. Wild Honey Pie wasn't designed to be a masterpiece. It was barely designed to be a song. Recorded during the White Album sessions, this bizarre little fragment was essentially a spontaneous Paul McCartney experiment. The track is extremely short, built around distorted acoustic guitar, repeated vocals, and a deliberately rough, chaotic arrangement. There is no conventional verse and chorus structure, and barely enough material to qualify as a traditional Beatles composition. And that's precisely the point. Paul wasn't trying to create another Yesterday. He was experimenting. The Beatles had enormous freedom during the White Album sessions, and that allowed them to record tiny musical ideas that might never have appeared on a more tightly structured album. George Harrison and John Lennon didn't treat the recording with the kind of reverence normally associated with a Beatles composition. Why would they? There was nothing here demanding a sophisticated arrangement or hours of painstaking studio work. It was a musical sketch, a joke, a fragment, something that could exist for less than a minute and then disappear. And rather than turning it into a serious production, the band essentially allowed it to remain exactly what it was. That attitude is important because it shows how relaxed the Beatles could sometimes be about their own mythology. By 1968, they were the biggest band in the world. Every recording could potentially become historically significant. Yet here they were, putting a strange little acoustic experiment onto a Beatles album. George's lack of seriousness toward Wild Honey Pie wasn't necessarily contempt. It was recognition of what the track actually was. Not every Beatles recording needed to be a masterpiece. Sometimes, a bizarre musical idea could simply exist for the fun of it. And Wild Honey Pie may be the clearest example of the Beatles deliberately refusing to take themselves seriously. Number 4. Maxwell's Silver Hammer, 1969. Few Beatles songs tested George Harrison's patience quite like Maxwell's Silver Hammer. On paper, the song was classic Paul McCartney, a catchy melody, a theatrical arrangement, and a bizarrely dark story, wrapped inside an almost cheerful pop song. But George didn't find it charming. He found it irritating. During the Abbey Road sessions, Paul became determined to perfect every detail of the recording. The band spent an enormous amount of time rehearsing and re-recording the track, with Paul continuing to push for additional takes and overdubs. For George, this was difficult to understand. The Beatles were approaching the end of their career. Studio time was limited, and George had his own compositions waiting to be recorded. Yet enormous amounts of time were being devoted to a song he considered lightweight and overly theatrical.
Maxwell, Edison, majoring in medicine.
George reportedly described the track as so fruity, a reflection of how little seriousness he attached to Paul's vaudevillian experiment. The contrast between the two Beatles couldn't have been clearer. Paul was obsessing over the details. George was essentially asking why they were spending so much time on it. And the more Paul pushed, the more frustrating the process became. The song eventually required multiple days of work, including extensive overdubs and additional instrumentation. It became one of the most labor-intensive tracks on Abbey Road. George's attitude was almost the opposite. He didn't want to spend his energy treating it like a major artistic statement.
Back in school again, Maxwell plays the fool again.
To him, Maxwell's Silver Hammer was closer to musical theater than the adventurous rock music he wanted the Beatles to explore. Ironically, that tension tells us something important about George himself. By 1969, He was no longer willing to treat every Beatles composition as equally important. He had his own artistic ambitions, and he knew exactly which songs he believed deserved his attention. Paul saw Maxwell's Silver Hammer as a song worth perfecting. George saw it as a song that never deserved all that effort in the first place. Number 3. Don't Pass Me By. 1968.
I listen for your footsteps coming up.
Ringo Starr had waited years for his first Beatles songwriting credit. When Don't Pass Me By finally appeared on the White Album, the reaction from his bandmates was hardly the solemn celebration he might have imagined. Ringo had actually been working on the song for years, playing fragments of it to the other Beatles long before it was finally recorded. But during the White Album sessions, the song finally became a full Beatles production. Ringo took the lead vocal and played drums, while Paul McCartney contributed bass and other instrumental parts. George Harrison and John Lennon were involved in the broader recording process, but the song remained unmistakably Ringo's creation. And that was part of what made it unusual. The Beatles had spent years operating around the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. George was only gradually gaining confidence as a composer. Ringo, meanwhile, was primarily known as the band's drummer.
On the mantel shelf, see the
So when he finally brought his own composition into the studio, there was an unmistakable sense of lightheartedness surrounding it. The song itself was deliberately straightforward, a country-tinged love song built around Ringo's distinctive vocal style. George Harrison didn't treat it like some grand artistic breakthrough, but that doesn't necessarily mean he disliked it. Instead, the Beatles' attitude toward the track reflected the relaxed, sometimes teasing atmosphere surrounding Ringo's songwriting efforts. The White Album sessions were already chaotic enough. The band members could be dismissive, sarcastic, or amused by one another's ideas without necessarily intending serious disrespect. And Don't Pass Me By fit perfectly into that environment.
I wonder where you are tonight, and why I'm by.
What makes the song historically important is that Ringo finally proved he could write a Beatles song and have it released on a major Beatles album. It may not have been treated with the same artistic gravity as Something or Strawberry Fields Forever, but it didn't need to be. Sometimes the point was simply giving Ringo a chance to step forward. And perhaps the most interesting thing about George's attitude is that the band could laugh at Ringo's songwriting experiment while still allowing it to become part of Beatles history. They didn't have to treat every song like a masterpiece to recognize that Ringo deserved his moment. Number 2, Savoy Truffle, 1968. George Harrison wrote Savoy Truffle, but even he didn't pretend that every word in the song carried some profound artistic meaning. The track appeared on The Beatles, better known as the White Album, and was inspired largely by George's friendship with Eric Clapton. Clapton had developed a serious love of chocolate and other sweets, and George would often tease him about it. During one visit, Harrison came across a box of assorted chocolates and noticed the elaborate names attached to them. That became the foundation for the song. Instead of writing another deeply spiritual composition, George turned a box of chocolates into lyrics. Creme tangerine, Montélimar, ginger sling. The words were essentially a playful catalog of sweets, assembled into a funky Beatles track. George wasn't trying to disguise the joke. The song was meant to tease Clapton. And that explains why Harrison himself could later look back on the lyrics with a certain amount of amusement, rather than treating them as some great poetic achievement. The contrast with George's more serious work is striking. Around the same period, he was writing songs about spirituality, consciousness, and the nature of existence. Then he wrote a song about chocolate. But that was precisely the point. George didn't believe every Beatles song needed to carry a profound message. Sometimes a song could simply be funny. Sometimes it could be written to make a friend laugh. And sometimes the lyrics could be little more than an elaborate inside joke. Ironically, the music itself is far more sophisticated than the premise suggests. Paul McCartney contributed bass, Ringo Starr played drums, and the arrangement featured a powerful brass section that gave the song its distinctive sound. So while the lyrics were deliberately playful, the recording was anything but careless. Savoy Truffle became another example of George's ability to separate the seriousness of the music from the seriousness of the subject. He could write about spirituality one day and chocolate the next, and perhaps that's exactly why the song remains so memorable. George Harrison didn't always take his own lyrics seriously. Sometimes he simply wanted to have fun. Number 1. If You've Got Trouble, 1965.
If you've got trouble, then you've got less trouble than me.
If there was ever a Beatles song that sounded like it was never meant to be taken seriously, If You've Got Trouble would be a strong candidate. Recorded during the Help sessions in 1965, the track was written specifically for Ringo Starr to sing. The idea was to give Ringo another light-hearted number that could fit his humorous, character-driven style. But the song never really came together. Ringo delivered the lead vocal, while the other Beatles provided the instrumental backing. George Harrison contributed guitar, including a solo that sounds noticeably restrained compared with the more adventurous playing he was capable of. That almost casual performance tells its own story. George wasn't treating the recording as an important artistic statement. He was simply helping the band get through a novelty track.
When you ask for money and things.
And eventually, the Beatles themselves decided that If You've Got Trouble wasn't good enough to release. Instead, it was left in the vault. The song remained unheard by the public for decades until it finally appeared on Anthology 2 in 1996, giving listeners a glimpse into the enormous amount of material the Beatles recorded that never made their official albums. What's fascinating is that the Beatles could afford to discard songs like this. They were producing so much material, and their standards were becoming so high, that some recordings were simply considered not worth releasing.
If you've got trouble, then you've got less trouble than me.
For George, If You've Got Trouble wasn't something to be carefully polished into a masterpiece. It was a throwaway. And perhaps that's exactly why his guitar contribution feels so understated. The Beatles didn't need every song to be great. Sometimes they simply recorded something, laughed about it, and moved on.